Hello and welcome to Sacred Blueprints, the shape of life, the universe and everything with Jazz Rasul. And that's me. We're going to be talking today about how life, the universe and everything comes into creation, and how it comes into creation through sacred shapes or sacred geometry as otherwise known. We'll look at how galaxies are created. We'll look at why it is that they tend to move around in spirals and why planets move around in circles. And we'll also have a closer look at light and why it moves in waves and what happens when you bottle those waves into energy packets that eventually become particles of matter that we otherwise know as atoms and electrons and protons. Then we'll go on from there and actually look at how that matter becomes alive. What is it that gets added to it that makes it alive? And finally we'll look at how living beings actually become conscious and how they start to have higher levels of intelligence and even begin to demonstrate such qualities as the ability to be compassionate and to show love. To finish off, we'll actually look at how love itself might be able to have a physical influence on the universe, and what can we do as individuals and as a society to take advantage of that to make our lives better and make the world a better place. So let's have a start with the actual question that this webinar is really about, which is, can a simple sequence of evolving patterns related to sacred geometry create everything in the universe? Now, if you were to look at the universe at large, then you'll probably find that most things tend to move around in circular paths. When you see a planet go around the sun, for example, then it will typically follow a circular path or a variation of it, like an oval or an ellipse, as otherwise known as a squashed circle. What you also find is that if you were to consider the Earth as it's going around the sun, you also have to consider the fact that the sun itself is going around the galaxy. So as the Earth goes around the sun, the path it traces out as it follows the sun around the galaxy isn't actually circular. It's actually more like a helix or a spiral. So you find that a lot of things in space, under the influence of gravity, they will tend to move in circles, or they will tend to move in spirals, or they'll tend to move in squashed versions of those, like ovals or ellipses or vortexes. So most things at a galactic scale, they tend to move in one of those three kinds of paths, circular or oval, or they tend to move in the form of spirals or vortexes. Now, that's what happens when gravity acts on space. It makes things move in those kind of orbits, if you will, circular orbits or vortex-like or spiral-like orbits. You certainly see the galaxy itself exhibiting this behavior, actually moving in a spiral fashion while at the same time moving in a circular fashion. It exhibits both those qualities. Now, the thing about space is that when gravity, the force of gravity, is applied to it, it behaves a bit like a wet sponge, in that you squeeze a wet sponge and water comes out. When you squeeze space, when you put pressure on space using gravity, then the energy that's latent in space, it actually comes and squeezes out. Empty space isn't really empty, as scientists have discovered in the last century. It's actually full of energy. It's full of what's known as quantum or 0-point energy. And if you squeeze that space, if you squeeze that quantum dimension, then energy actually comes out in the form of light. So at a grand scale, things move around in circles and vortexes, but what's interesting about space is that when you squeeze it and apply gravity to it, then you get waves of light actually come out. Now, waves are actually children, if you like, of circles. They're offspring of circles. So in a way, when space is worked on, things that move around in circles, they kind of evolve and they start to move in waves. They don't just move in a two-dimensional kind of path, they move around in three-dimensional space. So waves, they kind of pulse and send out wave fronts in the forms of spheres out into space. Now, light itself, when gravity or other force fields are applied to it, it can form into particles of energy or packets of waves even, which a lot of scientists recognize as being particles of energy. Now, those particles of energy are actually arranged in a certain way. They typically will form a crystalline structure. So those energy particles will eventually form material particles like protons and neutrons and atoms, and those atoms will go on and form molecules. And those molecules typically will take up a crystalline structure. It could be a cubic structure, it could be hexagonal or a diamond type structure, but typically it's a regular crystalline structure that repeats itself from atomic scales right up to scales that are visible. If you have ever done an experiment at school with copper sulfate, you might remember that when you hang a string in a copper sulfate solution, then crystals form on it which are the same shape as the crystals at atomic scales. So that's an example of how geometry mirrors from atomic scales right up to human scales. Now, that crystalline matter itself, it takes on a form which is vital for living organisms, which is known as a fractal. A fractal is a pattern which repeats itself at different scales. So if you look at the patterns on the right, for example, if you look at the triangle, for example, you can see that if the triangle had triangles added to its sides, it would form a star. And if the new sides themselves had triangles added to them, you begin to see something form a bit like a snowflake. And you can repeat that with other kind of shapes. You can do that with squares, you can do that with hexagons, and you can see those variations that you have on the screen there on the right. And whenever you have a pattern which repeats itself at different scales like this, it's known as a fractal. Fractal is short for fractional dimensional object. I'm not going to go too much into that. I think it's better if I just show you these things, and you probably learn a lot more by actually seeing them actually as they appear in nature. Now, if we move on to the next slide, then you'll see that the things I was talking about earlier are demonstrated on this slide. So certainly planets and other astronomical objects, they tend to move around the sun in our solar system in the paths that are circular or oval, or in extreme circumstances they follow paths called hyperbolae or parabolas, and they come in towards the sun and then leave. Typically things like comets will move in this kind of fashion. But all these paths are all derivatives of circles. So things in space tend to move in circles, and their derivatives like vortexes and spirals and parabolas. And you can see that when the solar system itself, if it was to be considered to be moving around the galaxy, you'd probably find that it actually traces out, along with all the other stars, a path which is actually very spiral in nature. So vortexes, spirals, ovals, parabolas, they're all examples of how things move at galactic and universal scales. Circle seems to be the platform or the foundational path from which everything seems to take in terms of its movement. And what we're going to do throughout the webinar today is really look at how things from galactic scales that move in circles actually change their shape as we move down the scales to planetary scales, to human scales, to systems in the body like the nervous system, right down to cellular scales and molecular scales. But we'll go beyond that. We'll actually look at how there are patterns which seem to define not just living organisms, but maybe even define our patterns of thought and feeling, that there is a structure, there's a geometry, there's a pattern, there's a shape to how our thoughts and feelings actually relate with one another. And that shape, that geometry of our thoughts and feelings, that geometry of our mind, is something that ultimately shapes our personality and our consciousness and our awareness. And if we want to change our consciousness or change our awareness or change our personality, it literally is about changing the thoughts and feelings that we have and the proportions that they have relative to one another, and how they're actually arranged inside of our minds, inside of our hearts, in terms of a pattern or a shape. You can change your thoughts by changing literally the shape of your thoughts and feelings relative to one another. And it's possible that you could even extend your consciousness and begin to perceive things in other dimensions and other times simply by altering the relationship between your thoughts and your feelings, between your perspectives and your attitudes. So by altering the geometry of your mind, it's possible to alter what you perceive in the universe. Just like it's possible to have a telescope actually look at things that are very, very far away by having a big lens and then a smaller lens behind it. You can swap that round and you can put a big lens nearer your eye and a smaller lens at the other end, and what you end up with is a microscope. So by changing configuration of things, it's possible to get completely different perspectives of the world around us. We can look at things really close, or we can look at things that are really far away and make them appear as if they're right in front of us. And that just happens by changing, as I said, alignment and geometry of various lenses that we have inside of our minds and inside of our senses. So it's possible to change the way we look at other people and how we are with them by literally changing the filters within our consciousness and changing their order or changing their arrangement. And we'll start to look at people in a completely different way. We'll see things about them maybe that we didn't really see before. And that's one of the properties of compassion and love. When you change the arrangement of your thoughts and feelings within yourself, your attitude, your awareness, and your perspectives of what you think is true, then you'll probably find that you begin to appreciate other people from the perspective of what it might be like being in their shoes. And that's usually something that gives rise to compassion and ultimately something even more coherent and powerful, which is love, which is really looking at the different things that you can have compassion for, whether it's for yourself or other people or even the planet, other life forms on Earth, and looking at how they are all arranged inside of you. And if they're arranged in just the right way, then you will experience love for all of those things. So really love is arranging compassion in a geometry where everything's in proportion, and the truth is not something you have to describe or that has to be explained to you. It's something you just experience. Now when you get to that point, then you'll find that love itself is something that's very powerful, enabling you to see the truth of the world and the truth of your relationships, the truth about yourself, your purpose, and why you're here. So we'll have a look a little bit at that a little bit later. Now, it's important to understand that really the entire universe is ultimately constructed on geometry. Einstein, when he wrote the special theory of relativity and wrote what he did around the subject of gravity, he basically said that space is something that's shaped by gravity. So the geometry of space, if you like, is shaped by gravity. But gravity is not something that shapes space alone. It can shape life. It can shape consciousness. It can shape our experience of time and space, a bit like what some people's experiences are of love. Love can actually make time appear to go faster or slower. It can make the world appear very, very big, or it can make the world appear very, very small. So love seems to have a very interesting relationship to gravity. It seems to have properties which we would normally ascribe to belong to gravity. And what we'll look at right at the end of today's webinar is the possibility maybe love and gravity are two things that work with each other, a bit like yin and yang, a bit like male and female. And if that's the case, then it means through compassion, through love, it's actually possible to change our experience of time and space, and maybe even create things in time and space. And see the birth of things that are material as a result of how we choose to arrange our consciousness within ourselves. So we'll have a look at a little bit about that later on. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about geometry, things look very different depending on how we are actually looking at the world. If you're sitting on the Earth and you ask yourself, well, what's the shortest distance between where I'm standing and somewhere else? Typically, most people would say it's a straight line. Well, that's technically true if you are on a flat surface, on a two-dimensional surface. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. However, if you are on a three-dimensional surface, like the curve of a sphere, for example, like the surface of the Earth, then actually the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line. It's actually a curve. And this curve is something that people will follow when they're actually flying and want to get to another place in the shortest possible time. A straight line from one point to another on the Earth is what's known as a rhumb line. On the other hand, following the curvature of the Earth, planes will often be able to cut short their journeys by several hundred miles. And as an example, on this screen, you can see the distance between Paris and New York, and you can see a straight line actually is 3,290 nautical miles. But following the curvature of the Earth, the actual distance is a lot less. And this is something that's characteristic about space. Sometimes the distances between two things are not obviously a straight line. Sometimes you need to follow a curve or go with the flow of something in order for you to really be able to follow a path where you're going to use the least amount of energy and you're going to cover the shortest amount of distance. These curves that planes and other vehicles follow in order to cover the shortest distance across 2 points along the Earth are known as great circles. Great circles have got the same diameter as the Earth, and if you want to move between any 2 points on the Earth, you simply draw a great circle where those 2 points are somewhere on that circle, and you'll find that that curve that comes between those two points is the shortest distance between those 2 points. Now you can extend this out into space. You might draw a line between our solar system and the nearest star, for example, but it turns out that that's actually not the shortest distance. Space, just like the Earth, is curved, it's thought, and it may be that the actual journey from us in our solar system to the nearest star is actually not a straight line. It follows a curve because maybe space is curved too. It's curved in time as opposed to curved in space. I'm not going to go too much into that now. I just want to introduce the idea that straight lines are not necessarily the shortest distance between two places, especially when we're talking about things which are not two-dimensional in terms of a surface, but maybe we're talking about a three-dimensional volume of space, or we include space and time, in which case we're talking about 4 dimensions. The shortest distance between 2 points is usually never a straight line in those situations. Now, if we have a look at the next slide, you'll see that it is possible to take circles and create waves from them. I'm not going to go too much into this right now, but one of the things that you can do, for example, if you were to watch the propeller from the side and look out the path that its edges actually trace, then you would find that it actually traces out a wave. And it's possible, therefore, for you to create a wave shape from a circle. Like I said, I'm not going to go too much into it now. I just ask you to accept that it's possible to create waves from circles. And you can get waves of different frequencies or different wavelengths, where the distance between one peak and the next is what is known as the wavelength. The shorter that wavelength is, the shorter the distance between one peak and another, the greater the number of waves you're going to see, so the greater the frequency of the wave. Now, this is what happens with light. Space, which is normally run really by things that move in circles, when it's squeezed, it gives out light. And light, the particles of light that light is made up of, photons, they tend to move, not in circles, but they tend to move in waves. So it's interesting that when gravity is applied to space and things in space move around in circles, the result is something that moves around in waves, which is something that comes from circles. So in a way, waves are children of circles, if you will. Now, it's possible for light itself to be captured and different frequencies of light to be bottled up. And if you get the right mix of frequencies and bottle them up into a packet of waves of different frequencies, then that packet of waves, which you see on the bottom right of the screen here, is typically what will end up becoming a particle of energy. And lots of particles of energy, when they're combined, will end up forming an actual material particle, like an electron, or a quark, or a proton, or a neutron, for example. And they themselves, of course, go on to make atoms. Now, if we look at the next screen, you'll see that the energy particles, they start off as waves, but if you try and capture those waves in a fixed volume, then they take on certain kinds of shapes. So you can see here something called orbitals, and this is the path, if you like, that gets traced out in a volume of space by something like an electron. It seems to take on various kinds of configurations or geometries. Electron, when it's captured, it tends to either take on a space, it lives in a space which is spherical, or it might live in a space of two ovals, which it jumps between, or many more, as you can see in the bottom picture on the left. Now, when you actually capture energy in this way, it's possible that it's going to end up in one of many different kinds of architectures. It can end up in an architecture, a crystalline architecture, which is got cubes as its central foundation, as its building blocks. It could have diamond shapes, it could have hexagonal shapes. There's lots of shapes, and these are all the regular shapes that are ascribed to Plato, the Platonic solids, otherwise known as things like spheres, things like tetrahedrons, things like cubes, things like dodecahedrons, those kinds of things, those regular shapes in a crystalline form. So far we've seen circles turn into waves, and then waves get captured into wave packets of energy, and those packets of energy get arranged in a crystalline fashion, and they form the molecules of matter that we're familiar with in the world and in the universe. So you might see there's a natural progression going on here. Circles are converted into waves, waves are captured into energy particles are captured into crystalline architectures. So this is how matter evolves, not over time, but over space. It's important to recognize then that you can change anything in the universe from one form to another simply by changing its geometry. You don't necessarily have to do that over time. You don't have to allow evolution to take place over time. You can change the form of something and its function by just altering its geometry right here in the present moment. So there can be evolution over space as well as over time, as I've indicated. If you start from galaxies and then go to light, and then you go into what light can be condensed into, which is energy, and then energy can be condensed into material particles, that is kind of the life cycle of matter. So far we've talked about how empty space goes on to become light, and then how that becomes energy particles that eventually become material particles. So that sequence, that life cycle so far, has only brought us to ordinary matter. But what's really amazing is what happens from this point onwards. When these crystalline architectures actually start arranging themselves in a very particular way, what's known as a fractal architecture, then it's possible that they can become the seeds for life when a special ingredient is added to them. So it literally is a case of just add water and you will have life. Now, when these crystalline structures are arranged in a branch-like structure or a repeating structure, and you add what's known as liquid crystals to these structures, things like water, things like DNA, then it turns that ordinary matter into living matter. And it's really important to understand that if you want to take ordinary matter and you want to make it alive, then you have to use something which is not quite solid in terms of its crystalline architecture. This crystalline architecture is kind of fluid, it's not fixed. And when you see crystals that can roughly keep their shape, but they can bend and they can flex, those kinds of crystals have a kind of flowing nature to them, so they're called liquid crystals. And DNA is an example of that, and water is. And when you literally DNA water in a very special way to ordinary matter, then you find that that ordinary matter can become alive. Now here's a picture of a liquid crystal, and you can see that the ordinary matter, solid matter on the left, there's an illustration there of what it looks like, and you can see that it's pretty regular. And liquid, the particles are a lot more fluid and moving around, but with a liquid crystal it seems to be something in between, and you'll find that it seems to have a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of give in terms of its particles. So when you look at a digital watch, for example, it's made up of liquid crystal, and if you actually pass an electrical current through a liquid crystal, one moment it can be transparent and you can see through it, but when the electrical current is applied, then all the molecules arrange themselves differently and they can actually block the light from coming through, and it won't be transparent anymore, it'll be opaque, it'll be like a dark grey colour. And that might form, for example, the shape of a digit or something in your digital watch. So liquid crystals respond to changes in electrical and magnetic fields, and they're to be found in a lot of places in living systems. They're found clearly in DNA. DNA is something that breaks itself up into a bit of structure and then recreates itself. So in that sense, it's not a fixed crystal. It's got a fixed structure, but it seems to be able to break apart and come back together again, which seems to be more like what a liquid does. So in that sense, DNA is actually a liquid crystal in terms of its behavior. And as I said, whenever you add liquid crystals to the right certain kinds to solids, ordinary matter, it's possible for that ordinary matter to start taking on properties of being alive, of being living. So DNA, along with other liquid crystals like water, they're very important because they literally are catalysts for taking ordinary matter and turning them into living matter. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we can actually have a look at a cross-section of DNA. Now, the picture on the left is a view of DNA from looking down the tube of the DNA, down the spiral of the DNA. So it's looking at it from the end, if you like, and looking down the tube, down the spiral, down the vortex that makes up DNA. Now, when I did my master's degree in the 90s, one of the things I had to do was write software which would display molecules on the screen based on their atomic positions relative to one another, coordinates. And one of the first things that I modeled was DNA. And I'd never seen DNA end on. And when I loaded up the data for DNA, the first thing that came up on the screen was an image not too dissimilar to the one that you've got here on the left, this rosette shape, this perfect symmetry to it. And it was amazing. It looked like one of those rose windows that you see in churches. And it actually has very similar symmetry and design to it as well. So I don't think the rose windows that we see in churches are just a pretty design. I suspect there's a certain kind of geometry to them which is somewhere linked into DNA, and someone somewhere in time perhaps knew that that geometry was linked into life, even though they didn't have any microscopes or anything to view DNA at the time. And again, you see here that the DNA itself has got this circular cross-section, but it seems to also have this spiral structure to it as well. And it's fascinating that this is occurring here at human scales as opposed to galactic scales. And I find this amazing, that you see certain things repeating themselves over the scales of the universe, and it seems to demonstrate the universe is kind of holographic in nature. Now, something else that has a liquid crystal property to it is the tubes of protein that make up the nervous system of your cells. These tubes of protein are called microtubules. And there's been a lot of research done on microtubules because it's thought that when people get anesthetics, the anesthetics act on these microtubules and they shut down the electrical currents that run along them. And as a consequence, a person loses consciousness. So it seems that microtubules and the electrical currents that run along them, they have something to do with our consciousness, because when those currents are shut down, the anesthetics, we lose consciousness. So these liquid crystal tubes seem to somehow be very important in our experience of consciousness and how it manifests in our lives. The picture on the left shows a cell, and you can see the network of microtubules, the nervous system that is, pervading throughout the cell. A lot of the chemical reactions that happen inside cells, they use microtubules as a surface upon which to carry out those chemical reactions. You can see that it's actually made up of little particles of protein, and these tend to actually come away from the microtubule, and they tend to come together, especially when the cell reproduces. So again, this is a structure which has got a spiral structure to it. It's circular in cross-section, and at times of reproduction for the cells, this spiral structure unravels and then it comes back together again. So again, it's a crystal, but it's liquid in terms of its actual shape, especially around times of the reproduction of the cell. And this is something you'll see characteristic of a lot of things which turn ordinary matter into living matter, and even living matter into conscious matter or conscious organisms. It seems liquid crystals play a key role in that conversion, that kind of alchemical change from base to precious, from ordinary matter to living matter, from living matter to conscious matter. So keep an eye out for liquid crystals. They show up in a lot of places, and one of the things that I'm interested in particularly is how liquid crystals work inside of our cells. Now, in your cells, there are these structures called mitochondria. Mitochondria used to be bacteria, and billions of years ago, they lived outside of our cells that would eventually become us human beings. And they are needed at the time because they have the ability to generate energy under the presence of oxygen. Now, our cells billions of years ago couldn't do that. So these bacteria actually got incorporated into our cells in a symbiotic way, and they allowed our cells to survive in an oxygen environment, and as a result generate energy for the cells in that kind of environment. Now, the inner structure of mitochondria is something that's got a lot of folds in it, liquid crystal folds, and these liquid crystal folds are surfaces upon which a lot of our actual respiration takes place. Oxygen comes down here and is used to cut up energy molecules, which are then used by the cell for its various chemical reactions. Mitochondria actually have their own DNA, and it's actually passed down to us from our mothers. It's never passed down to us from our fathers. So all your energy that you currently have is down to the mitochondria that have been supplied by your mother, and that was supplied by her mother, all the way back down to ancestral Eve. And it's these particular creatures, literally, that inhabit our cells, every one of our cells, that Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga are able to actually make more efficient, and therefore provide energy in a more sustainable way to our cells, and therefore ensure those cells live longer and that we ultimately age less. So mitochondria are very, very important in terms of our energy requirements, and they have a liquid crystal internal architecture. Now, you can take those regular crystalline structures and you can start laying them out in a particular fashion, and you will find that you will get the best designs for certain kinds of functions. So if we look at this example here, we can take a straight line and we can split it into two and create two shorter branches. Now imagine that there's a gene in our DNA that does this. It wants to build something, and it's got a simple instruction, which is from wherever you are, create two smaller branches that are about a third of the size of the branch that you're on, and make them separate by a few degrees. And you can see that's what's happened in this image on the left. A line has been split into two, and the two new branches are about a third or maybe half the original branch, and they're separated by a certain angle. Now, if you repeat that instruction with the new branches that you've got and add two smaller branches to them as well, and you keep doing that, you can see that, just after the third iteration of that, we've created something which is beginning to look like a tree. And we're doing it with a very simple instruction, which is split your branch into two and create two new branches which are a third or half the size of the one that you're on. And just following that process, it's very easy to create the semblance of a tree. Now, it's much easier in DNA to have a gene which says create two new branches and separate them by a certain number of degrees than it is to actually position every single branch and literally have its coordinates and say exactly when it's got to grow and when it's got to branch and when it's got to split. It's much easier having a two-part instruction which says split into two and create two branches which are half the size of the one you're on. And just that process repeated endlessly can lead to something which genuinely looks like a tree. Now, you can see the one image on the right, it looks like a tree, but it's very, very regular. It doesn't look really natural at all. And you can see if you compare it to an actual tree underneath, it's a bit different. And the reason is because actual trees, they don't grow in a regular way. They're exposed to changes in temperature, wind, forces of nature, water, animals living amongst them, and the direction of light that comes, and also the force of gravity itself. So it tends to be a bit rougher than a regularly created tree in the example that's shown above. But what's fascinating is that a tree, by its very shape, is actually performing a given function. If you look at what a tree's job is, it's to collect gases, carbon dioxide, and turn them into oxygen. And it seems that the biggest surface area it can get for that to take place is if it is in the form of a tree. And you've got a limited volume, but the way the branches all spread out means that you get the maximum surface area in that limited volume. Now, it's amazing that that is the case, because if shape actually defines function, and this particular shape is about something which is to do with exchange of gases and also distribution of nutrients, if you like, then this shape is something that seems to be a blueprint of efficiency for the exchange of gases or any other kind of materials or nutrients, and for the distribution of those across a whole architecture like a tree. Now, if you look on the image on the right, you can see what might technically be considered to be an upside down tree. It's the same shape, same kind of branching, and if we go with the rules that we have, which are that whenever we see this kind of shape, it means there's a particular function going on, we could say that the image on the right, whatever it is, we know it to be some lungs, but if we didn't know, we'd say, well, it probably is something that is an efficient design for exchange of something and for distribution of something. And it turns out that the actual surface area that you have inside your lungs for exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and for its effective distribution into your bloodstream, that surface area is the size of a tennis court, but yet it fills the small space inside your rib cage. So it's about maximum surface area but minimum volume. So it's about being really, really efficient in terms of the use of the space. And you'll find that things that we're going to talk about a little bit later very much focus on this theme. It's all about efficiency. It's all about conservation of energy and conservation of materials. These are very, very important because the universe has got a fixed supply of energy, and no new energy is ever created or destroyed. It's only transformed from one form to another. So it's really important that nature has designs which use energy efficiently and ensure that that energy is not wasted in any kind of way. Now here's some other examples where we see shapes other than a branching tree-like shape. The top one is a hexagon, and you can see that if we create additional kind of outcroppings from it, from each of the sides, then you can see if we repeat that behavior, eventually we end up with something which is beginning to look like a snowflake. Now it turns out that if you look at the image on the left, the hexagon, and you were to measure the perimeter of that, it will be a certain fixed size. But what's amazing is that if you measure the perimeter of the second image, it would actually be longer than the first one, because you're adding all these little indentations. And if you keep doing that ad infinitum, it's possible to actually have a shape which is of a limited area, as we're seeing here. It would fit inside of a circle, but the actual coastline, if you like, of this shape would actually be infinitely long. And you see this with a triangle as well. Next one down. You create triangles on each of the sides, and then you create triangles on each of the new sides, and you end up with something which looks a bit like a snowflake. You can do the opposite. You can take things away, as in the square. You can take chunks of square out and repeat that, and you end up with the image on the right, which again is beginning to look like a snowflake. The image that I've always found fascinating is what's known as Pascal's triangle, which is the image on the bottom right. If you take an ordinary triangle and take a square chunk out of it, and then out of each of the new triangles that are formed, take a triangular chunk out of those, and you keep doing this, keep taking triangular chunks out of each of the triangles that remain, you'll end up with the structure on the right. Each triangle is surrounded by 3 smaller triangles, and those smaller triangles are surrounded by 3 smaller triangles. The pattern just repeats endlessly. Now, you might say, well, what use is this? Well, it turns out that if you were to take that triangle and you were going to say, let's make a building from this, let's try and create the biggest building that we can, but we want to use the minimum of raw materials so we can minimize our costs, then this is probably the way that you do it. You would take out chunks while keeping the structure and its integrity pretty strong. And eventually you would have removed so much material that there's practically nothing there, but the architecture you've created is incredibly strong. Now that architecture that you're seeing there, that honeycomb-like architecture, is something that nature naturally defaults to when it wants to build structures for support. So your bones, for example, will have that kind of honeycombed architecture. The bones of wings, where you need maximum strength but minimum weight, they tend to have this honeycomb architecture too. Airplane wings have this architecture. So anywhere where you want to build something which is strong but light, you'll typically want to use some kind of honeycomb structure like this, a pattern where the holes kind of repeat themselves at different scales. So this is very important to keep this kind of architecture. If for one reason or another the holes start becoming not regular in the way that you're seeing here, then you'll probably find that the integrity of the structure actually starts to fade away. And this is something that you see with people who have osteoporosis, where the regularity of the holes, the pattern of the holes inside the bones, gets out of alignment, and as a result you end up with too many big holes, and the bone's density ends up getting dangerously low, and people can end up having fractures too easily as a consequence. So these patterns, each of them, where we're looking at a pattern which repeats itself at different scales, they're known as fractals. They're literally things, if you look back at what we said, are marks of efficiency by nature. Whenever you see a pattern like this, repeating at different scales, whether it's a tree, whether it's these triangles, or anything where you can see the pattern as a whole looks very close to what things are right at microscopic scales, then you're looking at an example of a blueprint which nature will probably use for some kind of efficiency, one kind or another, whether it's maximum strength, minimum weight, whether it's maximum surface area, minimum volume. It's got something to do with efficiency and to do with conservation of energy. Now you can see the branch-like structure in the circulatory system and the nervous system, and we know now that whenever we see a branch-like structure, it's about distribution and it's about exchange. That's fundamentally what it's about. So the heart is obviously concerned, along with the circulatory system, about distributing and exchanging blood with the body's tissues. And it's amazing that the vessels of the body only take up about 5% of the body's volume, yet wherever you cut yourself, on the tip of your tongue or on the tip of your toes, blood comes out. And it's because literally the branch-like structure can get into every little nook and cranny of your body. It's very efficient at getting blood at every possible place within your body. And it's the same thing with the nervous system. Nervous system's focused on exchange and distribution of messages or communicating messages. So if you want to ensure that the brain is able to communicate with all parts of the body, then you need to use a message distribution architecture that's going to be able to get everywhere, but use the minimum of raw material to do it. So it turns out that a branch-like structure is great for that. So whenever you see a branch-like structure, it's saying to you there's an efficiency being worked with here. This is the most efficient way of distributing something or exchanging something. So this relates to what I said earlier, that form seems to actually define function. Shape actually defines how something behaves. It shapes the being of something. Now, as I said earlier, everything up till now has been visible, and I've suspected for quite some time that there are structures in the body which have that branch-like structure to them, but they don't branch in space. They actually branch over time. Now what I mean by that is, if you take the straight line at the top and you take that as to be your body as it is functioning right now in terms of all of its biochemistry, and then you take something like a drug, and then the body splits into a new way of functioning, and then later on in time it might then change its nature again. And this ever-changing behavior over time, this branch-like splitting of function over time, is a fractal, but it's not a fractal over space. It's a fractal over time. So a biochemical process, if you will, is an example of a fractal over time. It's a liquid fractal. What that means is that it's not fixed in space. It changes. And there are things which can change our biochemistry and alter how our nervous system functions or how our brain functions. And examples of those things are liquid crystals in the body. These can influence the shape and the functioning of the body over time. So they're not strictly liquid crystals. They would better be called liquid fractals. And what they can do is not just change the biochemistry of the body, but they can actually do something else. It appears that these liquid crystals or liquid fractals, we normally know them as hormones. And hormones have very special properties, apart from being liquid crystals. They seem to be able to affect our functioning over time, which is why I call them liquid fractals as opposed to liquid crystals. Examples of this include things like adrenaline, which works from the adrenal glands, and then you have serotonin and melatonin, which look after how awake or asleep we actually are. And then you have other things like endorphins or enkephalins, which are released during exercise, and that can affect the way that we feel and affect the way that our brain functions. But these hormones and the proportions of those hormones, literally the geometry of the hormones relative to one another, they literally determine our physiological function at a given time, but they also determine our psychological function at any given time. So if you were to look at the balance of hormones in your body right now, the balance of serotonin, melatonin, adrenaline, endorphins, that balance gives you your current state of consciousness. If someone was to change that balance, someone was to give you a bit more adrenaline into your bloodstream or a bit more serotonin or melatonin, you would find your awareness start to alter. You'd find your consciousness would start to alter. Your perspective of the world would actually alter. How you see things, how you interpret things, how you make sense of the world would actually alter. it's almost like you are having your senses extended. So if we take the line at the top in the middle here to represent your senses as they are, and then what happens when you have this shift of hormones is that your senses start to extend out into additional dimensions, maybe into 2, and then again into a finer way into those dimensions, and a finer way still. It seems that the balance of hormones in our body, it's possible to alter them so that we can extend the fidelity or the resolution of our senses. We don't just see things in space and time. We can actually see things beyond space and time into additional dimensions, even additional dimensions of consciousness even. So it seems by changing the proportion of concentrations of hormones in the body, it's possible to change the level of your consciousness or the extension of your consciousness into the dimensions that you're actually immersed in. Now, there are well-known compounds which can alter the balance of hormones in the body and lead to that shift in consciousness and perception to happen very, very quickly. And these are compounds such as LSD, DMT, which is the active compound of the ayahuasca plant, which many people take in order to have these altered states of consciousness. Now, the thing is, if the body can take these compounds and it can create shifts in hormones, it can only do that if it's got things within it already that work with those kind of compounds. And it turns out that DMT exists naturally in the body. There's lots of opiates which exist naturally in the body, but they're usually at very, very small concentrations. And they can rise artificially, through doing an ayahuasca tea ceremony, for example, or taking LSD. Now, I wouldn't advocate really doing any one of those things. For a start, they're illegal in this country. What I would actually suggest, if you want to alter your consciousness, the simplest way to do it is through exercise. Of course, you can increase the power of that altered state of mind by working with very specific and more ancient forms of exercise like yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong and pranic healing. These actually alter the geometry of your body by putting it through various postures and get your nervous system and endocrine systems to work with each other to change the balance of hormones in the body. The Qigong system, which works with what's known as opening the gates of the body, it does this through various breathing exercises, various postural movements that lead to the endocrine and nervous systems actually changing the balance of hormones in the body. And one of the consequences of that is that you go through an altered state of mind. As a consequence, you've got to start having spiritual experiences. But some people who have been practicing this for a long time, like the Shaolin monks in China, for example, they can alter their hormones in their body in such a way that it almost seems to change the physics of their body. The meridians, the acupuncture points that they work on stimulating through their exercises like Qigong and Tai Chi, it causes physiological consequences in the body which typically result in the nervous system communicating with the endocrine system and changing the hormone concentrations in the body of things like serotonin, melatonin, adrenaline, and DMT. So it doesn't just alter consciousness, it can appear to alter the very material nature of the body. And as a consequence, Shaolin monks can do amazing things with their bodies. They can break iron bars of their head, they can bend iron bars with their throats, they can be held aloft on spears, they can do finger stands where they just balance their entire body on 2 index fingers. So working with these hormones and these breathing exercises that are typical to yoga and Qigong and Tai Chi can do amazing things for your body, but it can also give you an altered state of mind that allows you a much finer form of perception about your existing world, but also maybe aspects of it, dimensions of it that are not normally visible to us. It's very much like, if you look through an infrared camera, you can see things in the dark that you might not normally be able to see. Your senses are extended by using that instrument. It turns out if you change the balance of hormones in your body, something similar happens. You can change how your body behaves. You can change how your consciousness receives things or picks up things, or even how it engages with the truth about its perceptions and what comes to it through the world. So this change of geometry, change of consciousness in the body, all comes about using liquid crystal compounds, which we traditionally know as hormones. So DMT naturally exists in the body, that's spirit, otherwise known as the spirit molecule. Serotonin and melatonin for our sleep and awake cycles, adrenaline for our overall sense of strength and energy and drive. All of these things have liquid crystal properties, and when you plant them in specific fractal architectures in the body, it causes a shift in the shape of your mind, a shift in the shape of your body's physiology and biochemistry. Now, you can't see it, but if you were to look at it from a higher dimension, you would be able to see that your geometry is actually changing across time, across space. So that's what these hormones do. They actually change the geometry of our body as it evolves over time. Okay. Now, I'd like to finish off by looking at the possibility that liquid crystals don't just change the pharmacology and biochemistry of the body, but they can actually go beyond altering our consciousness. They can form our consciousness into a shape which actually allows us to experience greater awareness and greater intelligence. Just like you can take ordinary matter and you can convert it into living matter using liquid crystals like DNA and microtubules, it's possible that you can use compounds like DMT or serotonin, melatonin, and adrenaline to take ordinary consciousness and turn it into more advanced consciousness. And again, the Chinese and the Indians seem to have found ways of doing this without necessarily resorting to drugs. And the final kind of point I want to finish on talking about today, that's discussed in Sacred Blueprints in a lot more detail, is the geometry of our emotions. The Chinese consider that the emotions are associated with certain elements, fire, earth, metal and water and wood. And these elements, they have relationships to each other. They have a geometrical relationship to each other, so that they actually feed each other or support one another or even control one another. Now, the image that you're seeing here is the circle path is known as the support cycle, or the generative cycle. And the Star of David that we're seeing in the middle there, that's known as the control cycle. Now, your emotions, your actual feelings and your thoughts have geometrical relationships to one another. Now, if you can arrange them in the perfect way, then you will be able to see the truth about any given situation in your life. You will be in a state of emotion which lends itself towards you achieving your purpose in life. That arrangement of thoughts and feelings, when everything's in proportion and in its place, normally that kind of arrangement is known as a sacred arrangement or sacred geometry. And this applies to your feelings just as it does to things in the real world. So, for example, if we look at wisdom, fear and will, which are associated with the water element in the kidneys, you can see that there's a trinity which links the three of them together. When you have a lot of fear, it's usually because there's something unknown in your life that you're concerned about. There's something you don't have wisdom about, and that can lead to your will actually not being able to move forwards from that point. So wisdom, fear and will are a trinity. Any one of these is affected by the other two. So if you have a lot of fear, it's either because you're lacking wisdom, or you've got wisdom but you don't have the will to work with it. Similarly, if you're lacking will in your life, it's because there's something going on between your fears and your wisdom. Maybe your wisdom is not strong enough, and as a consequence, your fear just can't be managed. Sometimes if you're lacking wisdom, it's simply a matter of looking at your will and looking at your fear and seeing how they're working with each other. If your fear is dominant, then your will will be suppressed and you won't learn anything new from your experiences. You won't gain wisdom. So it also appears that trust, anxiety, and intent work as a trinity as well. So when you're really anxious, it's usually because there's something you don't trust going on. And that might be because you're not clear about your intentions or somebody else's. So these three things have a relationship to each other. In the liver and the element of the wood, we see that compassion, anger, and courage are related. So when someone is really angry, it's usually something that they are having an issue with, where they don't understand where the other person is coming from. They lack compassion for the other person. So usually when there's a lot of compassion, anger is usually kept in its place with the right kind of courage. So in this situation, you can see what would happen. For example, if someone had a lot of fear, it would actually affect a person's anger and compassion and their courage. And you can also see that that might be due to there being a lack of righteousness in the person, a lack of integrity. There's too much shame, there's too much integrity going on. And as a consequence of that undermining, there's not enough support for a person's wisdom. So you'll find that there are emotions that support each other, and there are emotions that control one another. And they're arranged in this geometrical fashion. If you can arrange your thoughts and feelings such that they all support each other and control each other in a way where you have the greatest awareness and the greatest access to truth in your life, then your thoughts and feelings have really arranged themselves into a form of a sacred geometry of some kind. The net result of this is that you will start to really be able to relate to yourself and to other things in the world more effectively. You'll be able to demonstrate more compassion. The Tibetans consider compassion to be the most powerful force in the universe because of its ability to take our thoughts and arrange them in a way where we get to see the truth and appreciate the truth. Now, you might have compassion towards yourself, to people that you love, to the world. There's different kinds of compassion. Now, if you arrange those compassions in the right way and put them into proportion, then you'd find that love is something that would naturally emerge in you. So what we've seen so far is you can change the geometry of a living organism, courtesy of liquid crystals, and you can make it become conscious and alter its level of intelligence. But you can then take feelings and change their arrangements and their proportions with respect to one another, and then that mental or emotional state can actually evolve into compassion. You arrange the different kinds of compassion that you have into the right kind of arrangement and the right proportion relative to one another for what you need for your purpose in life, and you will naturally have love actually emerge as a consequence of that. Now, love is very strange in the sense that it seems to be something that allows us to see the true shape of things in the universe and in our own lives. It enables us to see things in an undistorted way. It can also lead us to have experiences which seem to actually have an altered experience of time or space. Time seems to slow down or speed up, the whole world shrinks or things expand, and love has a very strange kind of nature in that respect, that it can seem to change our experience of space and time. Something that normally is the realm or remit really of gravity. So we've kind of come full circle here, because there's the implication that love, maybe it's not just an illusion that time is moving faster or slower and the world is shrinking or getting huge or big when we are actually in a state of love. Maybe that's a genuine thing that's going on. Maybe when we're in a state of love, we can show compassion to ourselves, our thoughts and feelings can arrange themselves in the right order, that our physiology and our chemistry alters as a result of hormones, and that actually changes the material nature of our body. Maybe love is something that can actually heal our material body when it's not well. But I think the opposite is possibly true too. What if love is something that isn't just giving us an illusion of altered experience of space and time, but maybe it's actually doing it. Maybe it's actually causing a shift in space and time. Unconditional love, where all of our various kinds of compassion are arranged in a sacred geometrical way so that we experience a grace in our lives, and people experience us as being in a state of grace. It leads to a very unusual state. Just like the hormones may very well change the physical nature of our bodies, and maybe even the physics of how we are, as we've seen with the Shaolin monks. What could compassion do? What could love do? Could it change the very physics of how we are alive and how we are functioning? Could a single act of love, for example, influence gravity in a way where it could cause matter to become created? I've often asked this question, which is, maybe the universe, began as a result of a single act of unconditional love, and it shaped gravity and space into the matter that would explode into the process of the Big Bang that would eventually create the galaxies that we know, the solar system that we know, the Earth that we know, and all the living organisms with their consciousness that we know. Maybe everything came really from an unconditional act of love. Now, it's at that point that I want to finish, and at this point what I'd like to do is stop the formal presentation about these various blueprints and just ask for people's feedback about what they think and about the universe actually being constructed and formed and evolving simply through the alteration of shapes and through the alteration of consciousness and through the alteration of our experience of love, and how that physically connects us to the universe that we're actually a part of. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to actually open up the discussion to people who are listening in. If you would like to ask a question, then just put your hand up using the hand feature on the control panel, and then what I'll do is I'll open the microphone to you, and you can ask a question if you've got one in mind. So the floor is open for you to put your hands up and ask a question. Alternatively, you can just drop a question into the question area or the chat area, and I'll just keep an eye out on that and see if there's something there that I can respond to. Okay, let's look. While people are choosing questions inside their minds, I think I might go and have a chat with certain people. Let's have a look. Someone has asked a question, but I don't know who it is, asking about the Princeton project, about has affected seismic devices around the world during events and that were generated mass motion. And of course, seismic events do respond to changes in electrical and magnetic fields around the Earth, as well as gravity. So it doesn't surprise me that the quantum devices that are used for measurement of those things would have been affected in some kind of way. There's something that I've watched closely over the years, so it's something I'm aware of, and I understand equally that seismic events can of course be picked up by animals in advance of the actual physical effects. So clearly there are things going on with those kind of situations that are affecting the nervous systems or consciousness of animals, and I suspect that if it works one way, that it probably works the other way too, that shifts in consciousness can cause shifts in seismic readings too. So I suspect it works both ways in that respect. Let's see if anybody's put their hand up. Nobody knows how to put it up. Mercedes has, so let's listen to Mercedes. Can you hear me, Mercedes? You put your hand up.
Oh, hello. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Thank you. The question relating to Princeton was from me,
Oh, right, okay.
and I was wondering. I mean, you pretty much answered it very well, but I was wondering whether you saw any future in that, because I think that particular project just died quietly, and that has always confused me, because there was a lot of enthusiasm from really top metaphysicists, and suddenly there was nothing.
Yeah, it's one of those things which I'm trying to recreate through another experiment, actually. I've created something called a resonance experiment,
Okay.
and it's designed to connect people through social networks, and the consequence will be that there will literally be a shift in vibration, not just in consciousness of people, but that shift in vibration should affect the resonant vibration of the Earth, the resonant frequency of the Earth, what's known as the Schumann frequency, and that should be
Yes.
able to be picked up and detected.
Great. You've obviously been probably following, or maybe know of, the Lynn McTaggart experiments as well with consciousness.
Yeah, the intention experiment. I worked with Lynn some time ago. I helped her out with one of her webinars and one seminars, and assisted her. But I reviewed her book, The Field, when it first came out for an organisation. So I'm pretty familiar with her material, which is centred on intent.
Yeah.
However, what I've tried to do with Sacred Blueprints is to actually look at why intent causes the influence that it does, what are the mechanisms, what are the structures in the universe that it can move through in order to cause shifts in material things in nature as well as in society.
And how can we help you with your resonance experiment?
Well, it's something that I'm in the process of launching again. I'm just changing some of the ways in which people can interact. We did run it last year, and quite a few of the people in this webinar, they are actually people who were in the resonance experiment last year, and they've continued to connect with each other and have amazing synchronicities and coincidences happen as a consequence. Which were predicted. We predicted that there would be synchronicities and coincidences, because when you connect people together by what they can learn from each other, then resonance is something that naturally arises, and that literally shifts the frequencies of those individuals' consciousness and the shared consciousness, shared vibration that they actually have. The very vibe that they have between them alters, and that can spread to people around them, people who aren't even part of the resonance experiment.
Wow.
Mm.
Exciting stuff. I love it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mercedes. I will just go to somebody else who might have a point to raise with me. Sue wants to say something. Sue, go ahead.
Unmuted.
Sue, go ahead.
Hi, Jazz. I was wondering, there's a lot of talk about people being able to change the weather by their thoughts and various practices. How does this apply where all this is concerned? I mean, when people have actually said they can change the weather, so do you know how that would work?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the weather, its main driver is to do with water in the atmosphere, the electrical fields of the Earth, as well as solar radiation. Those are the key kind of driving factors. Obviously, there's temperature and pressure and other factors too. But weather is what's known as a complex system. It's something that can alter its nature with the tiniest of influences. And that's very much like with what happens in the body. You know, if you change the concentration of one hormone a tiny amount, you can literally change the internal weather or climate of the body. So the systems that the body uses are very similar to the systems that exist in the Earth's atmosphere and the world's ecologies in nature. So if we are all connected together through those kinds of systems, then I don't see why it's not possible for the right shift in the right place to cause a shift in the weather locally and globally.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sue.
Always wonder how that worked.
Well, it comes down to chaos theory and what I've mentioned, which are fractals. Fractals, anything where you see a fractal, whether it's a cloud, a mountain, or a tree, it's something that has an inherent sensitivity to it, to something. And if you can find out what that something is, then you can change its nature very, very dramatically. An example of that is an allergen. You know, if someone has an allergy, you only need a tiny concentration of that allergen for that person to completely change their physiology and have their nose start to sniffle, their head blocked up, and you know, even in some cases like nut allergies, to go into an anaphylactic shock. Right? So it's down to sensitivity, and it's down to the architecture. And when you have an architecture which is sensitive to a particular trigger, then if you actually set that trigger off, you can cause a massive transformation with a minimum amount of energy.
Okay.
So it works the same
way. If I concentrate hard enough, I can make the sunshine tomorrow. It works the same way. Okay.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Sue.
you.
All right. Okay, let's see. Anybody else got their hands up? Christina is asking something, so let's ask what you want to say, Christina. Let's Let me just widen things here a little bit so I can see who I'm talking to. Yeah, Christina, you want to talk about fractality of love. Go ahead, Christina.
Okay. Hi. How are you? First of all, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
It's very inspiring and I think very useful for many other fields as well, and especially in my field of art and architecture and urban planning. I think it would be very interesting to develop some veins of these, some fractals of this conference. And secondly, I'd like to ask you, how do you see these sacred geometries related to social networks configurations so that they evolve in a more meaningful way? And thirdly, I'd like to say that how would you approach fractality of love?
Okay, well, the social networks is what the resonance experiment is about, and the idea is, of course, that one which has been taken from my background in coaching. One of the things I learned when I was doing coaching in business and other spheres was that all coaching really comes down to three simple acts. How you enable someone to get the support they need, how you help someone to be challenged and stretched, and how you help someone reflect and process things. Now, if you get a person to do each of those things in proportion and at the right times, then that person will naturally grow and develop. Now, what I realized was that if you can do that with an individual, then maybe there's a way of linking people up so that when a person's looking for support, they can find people who can give them that support. When they're looking to get themselves stretched and challenged, they can find people who will do that. And when they're looking for some reflection or time to process things, they can find people to do that. In order for that to be done, it's important to profile a person and look at how they're going about meeting their needs and how they're helping other people, how effective they are in helping other people meet their needs. And that DNA, that signature that results, what I call social DNA, it can be matched to other people. So that person can be matched to other people who can support them, can challenge them, and can help them reflect. And in fact, my software online, that's what it does. It matches a person to people who are similar to them and can support them. It provides a separate list of people who could challenge them or opposite to them. They've got strengths where they've got weaknesses and vice versa. And lastly, it connects them to people who can help them process and reflect, people who are kind of a mix of similar and opposite qualities. Now, that proportion of similar, complementary, and opposite is something that you'll probably find exists in an ideal form amongst your best friends. Your best friends know when to support you, they know when to challenge you, and they know when to just leave you alone, maybe help you process stuff, and they do things in the right proportions. But your worst enemies do the opposite. They tend to support you and collude with you when they really ought to challenge you. They challenge you when you really need some support, and they keep interfering, not allowing you to process or reflect things when you need some time to ponder on stuff. So having the right proportion of things, support, challenge, and reflection, is really, really important in your social networks. So the geometry of your social connections, how they're spread out in terms of who's going to support you, who's going to challenge you, and who's going to help you to reflect and process things, it's vital for you to grow through those social experiences. If you're hanging out with people who you need support from, but they're just challenging you all the time, that's not so good. If you're hanging out with people who you need to challenge you, but they're just colluding with you, that's no good either. And you also don't want to spend time with people who are helping you reflect too much. You want people to help you reflect on the right things as well. So getting things in proportion in terms of support, challenge, and reflection, it leads to a particular geometry, if you like, amongst your friends in terms of who are the people that are going to provide each of these things and in what proportion. So the software actually is able to figure out what kind of people you need to meet, who will give you the support you need, the challenge that you need, and the reflection you need in proportion to where you're at in your life and the kind of purpose that you're aiming for. So that's how sacred geometry shows up in social networks. It's about the balance of support, challenge, and reflection, and where you get it from, in the network that you've actually got. If it's all coming from one place, and there's not enough of a gene pool in terms of experiences of support, challenge, and reflection, then your growth is actually going to be quite stunted. It's going to be too excessive in one way, and it's going to be deficient in another way. But when everything's in its place and it's in its proportion, in other words, in its sacred geometry, you're going to get the best social experience of all. You're going to grow, you're going to have fun, and you're also going to shift as well. Does that answer that question?
Yes, perfectly.
And you're talking about the fractality of love? Yeah, fractality of love.
Yes.
If you look at what I mean by fractality, it's a pattern which repeats itself at different scales. And for me, love is literally one big fractal in terms of our experience. It's very similar to collaboration and compassion and charity, in that it's meant to be something that begins at home. You start with yourself, and you start with the simplest possible thing, which might be a thought that you're having and the feeling you're having about it. If you can get that thought and feeling to come to terms with one another, they can come to be together in the same place within you without conflict, then you've created love between your head and your heart, basically. And that's usually the first port of call. Creating harmony between your thoughts that you're having and the feelings that you're having is really, really important. So getting your head and heart to be working with things in the right proportion is really, really important if you're going to start showing compassion towards yourself, which is what the seed is for love. Ultimately, you can extend that out to how you feel about other people's thoughts and how you think about their feelings, and that can shape your compassion towards other people and the truth that you see about them, the truth they see about you, and that will shape the love effectively that emerges from that compassion. And then you can extend it out to your family, you can extend it out to your community, you can extend it out to your culture, your society. So in that sense, you're just repeating the same thing, but at different levels in your world. All you're ever doing is you're trying to get the head and heart to marry and give birth to your spirit. For me, that's what love has always been. It's about how do I get my head and heart to talk to each other and respect each other in a way which leads to the conception of my spirit. Just like a man and woman can come together and give birth to a child, I think the head and heart can come together and give birth to our spirit. And the act of doing that is what I feel love's job is. Its job is to get the head and heart to work together to nurture and create and evolve our spirit. And you can do that individually, you can do that with your family, you can do that with your culture, you can do that with the world, you can do that with the universe. The same pattern, same mechanism, same process can be used right up to kind of galactic scales and aliens if you want to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's really beautiful.
Okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to move over to some other questions that people have got.
Okay.
But thanks very much, Christina.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, Mercedes, did you have another point to make? Another question? Nope. Gone. Okay. Sue, you had your hand still up? No, that was obviously left over from last time. Okay, that's great. Ryan, I think, had something to say. Could you comment on what you said about form and geometry not needing time to change? That's something we're all familiar with, the idea of Darwin's theory of evolution, that things take time to come into a particular shape or evolve features, and it can happen over millions of years, or it can happen over a couple of generations, for example. But evolution in that traditional sense usually is something that happens over time. But I think it's something that doesn't necessarily require time in order for features to change. And I gave you an example of earlier of allergens. I said if someone's exposed to an allergen, like a pollen, and they get hay fever, that didn't take millions of years for that response to come up. One moment they're perfectly normal, and the next moment they're functioning completely differently. And it's because the body's systems are of a particular architecture, and they're sensitive to particular triggers. And those triggers didn't necessarily exist before. Somewhere they were acquired, and they may have happened in an instant. And it implies that the body can learn things, consciousness can learn things that it can become sensitive to. It can create switches, in other words. And when those switches are thrown by a certain trigger of some kind, then the consciousness can alter in an instant. When you have an epiphany, for example, when you have a sudden realization, or you suddenly have a flash of brilliance about something, that's an example where you are leaping over lots of perspectives in an instant. Now, you didn't have to take 20 years to come to that realization. It just happened suddenly. And it's because there's been a massive shift in relationships between your thoughts and feelings and your perspectives. And that shift, that seismic shift in your consciousness, led to a completely different worldview. Some of you may have heard, the story about Stephen Covey, I think, and others mentioned it takes 10,000 hours to create excellence in any particular discipline or skill. And I kind of questioned that and said, well, I think it's not 10,000 hours. I think it's 10,000 perceptions. Sometimes if you can move through enough perceptions, then you find that you no longer think about the world in a different way, nor act towards it, or behave towards it in a particular way. Your skills themselves may change. You may acquire new abilities because you change your perceptions. And you can leap across many perceptions in one go, and that's really what an epiphany is, or a realization is, or a flash of awareness actually is. And when you move through lots of perceptions in one go, you are literally collapsing your mind into a different shape, into a different view of the world. You're altering the arrangement of your thoughts and feelings relative to one another and their proportions, and that's giving you a different awareness of the world. So change can happen in an instant. It just requires a shift in perceptions and their arrangements relative to one another inside your mind, and their importance relative to one another. NLP is something that does that quite a lot. You can reframe things. So a reframe is an example of how evolution can take place in an instant. You can be cured of a phobia with a reframe. So reframing is literally altering the geometry of your thoughts and feelings and your perceptions, and it can lead to a physical alteration of your body's systems and how they respond to the world. And in some situations, like with the Shaolin monks, for example, through the practices that they do in conjunction with altered hormone balance, it can literally change the physics of their body and the features of their body that normally evolution would have taken millions of years to create, but through the right shift in hormones and the right shift in perceptions, it can be done in a matter of years or even in an instant. I hope that answers your question, Ryan. Now, I can just open it up to you actually and see what you think about that. What do you think about that, Ryan?
Very interesting. Hello, everyone. I think it's interesting that I read somewhere that the father of yoga, Patanjali, said that creation happens outside of time, and it would be interesting to, from an individual perspective, try to understand what that relation is between the forces that are acting on our consciousness and how we're sort of relating to that. I mean, you use NLP as a example of an instant sort of change, and that kind of leads me to the idea of love. You were talking about love, and love actually as a tool. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and what would be the purpose of love as a tool? Actually.
That's a good question. I mean, people like Amma and Gandhi and various others like Mother Teresa, people who fundamentally use compassion and love as something that they are ingrained with, embedded with, people can just step into their fields and their perceptions can alter, and person can either burst into tears or burst into laughter. And an example of that, is when we look at comedy, when we look at laughter, and we look at jokes and humor. In order for you to laugh at a joke, you go through a story and then you're expected to make a leap to a completely different perception. And if you can make the leap, that's usually when you get the joke, and that's when you usually burst into laughter. And it's a very similar principle. It's a very similar principle. If someone can give you the right lead in and then give you a leap to another perception which isn't so big, or at least is within your worldview for you to be able to make, then you can see the world in a completely different way in an instant. And it'll do one of those two things. It'll either make you burst into laughter or make you burst into tears. So love is very powerful. I think it has a similar influence to humor in that it enables us to make leaps in perception that literally make us burst into tears or burst into laughter and joy.
And what, back to your analogy about NLP, because that's a psychological tool that phobia is a psychological reaction to a perceived reality, and then you'll have for example, in talking therapy, where you pay somebody to sort of talk you through your phobias, and is that something to do with authenticity and your sort of authentic perception of love, or could you comment on that?
Yeah, there are lots of ways, of course, to work with phobias. I have something which I've been looking into recently, which is, it links into, remember I said at the end, love has got something to do with gravity, that they might be linked. If that's the case, and a phobia is a form of fear, and it's linked to the absence of love in some kind of way within you, I realized there was a common occurrence with a lot of people, energetically speaking, which is that when someone has a phobia, it's a bit like having a center of gravity moved to a place where you feel unstable. So, for example, if you're in an aeroplane and the aeroplane suddenly sinks, your center of gravity more or less stays where it is, but the rest of your body goes down. So, relatively speaking, your center of gravity moves up from where your belly button is up towards where your chest is. Now, when the plane recovers, the center of gravity may end up still remaining in your chest, and you may feel like you're off balance, so you're top heavy. And the experience of that is one of kind of mild panic or fear or anxiety. Now what's interesting is if you can move your center of gravity back down to where it belongs, below your belly button, then the phobia can actually have its effects attenuated. It can actually be reduced. And I'm thinking very strongly that when someone's consciousness is physically, have their attention moved to where their center of gravity is supposed to be, that's one of the things that I think NLP does. But then there are other practices that do something very similar. Tai Chi, which centers its movements on moving from the center, from your center of gravity. People who adopt that after a while are going to have their center of gravity return back down to where it should be. They will literally become more grounded. They'll become more settled. And anything which moves attention or moves the center of gravity or the center of your energy back down to where it should be is going to lead you to become more grounded, and it's going to lead you to have any phobia that you have fade away as a consequence. The fear will be literally put in its place. It'll be held down, and it will only rise up if it happens to serve your growth in some kind of way.
Do you think that's an energetic shift, actually, as opposed to that, for example, if a psychological shift happens and it changes the...
I think it's all three in various, and it's a proportionate thing. It's another sacred geometry. I've got the trinities on the screen, for example, compassion, anger, and courage, and wisdom, fear, and will. I think there's another trinity here between physiology, between energy and psychology. Your psychology has a center. Your physiology has a physical center of gravity, and energy has a physical center of gravity in the body and around it. Now, it turns out that when these centers are not coincident, when they're not in the same place, when any one of them is gotten out of alignment, it ends up causing illness in the body, or it causes illness in the psychology, or it causes illness of an energetic or spiritual kind, depending on which thing it was that went out of its central location in conjunction with the other things. So I've studied Qigong and energy medicine, and that's one of the things I realized, that we don't just have a physical center. We have a psychological center and we have an energetic center. And a healthy person has each of these centers located in the same place. They're all centered on a kind of universal center. And if any one of those centers comes out of alignment with that universal center, for example, if energetically your energy shifts its center, then you start having energetic issues. If your physiological center of gravity alters and shifts, it can lead to physiological, biochemical disturbances in the body. So there is a factor which relates to all three, I think. And love ultimately is what you feel when all three are in their place. All of your centers are centered. I think in the recent film, The Karate Kid, the kid was being asked to focus, and he said he was focusing, and his master said, "No, you need to focus your focus." And I think it's a very similar principle with this. It's all very well being centered, but are you just centered psychologically, but not energetically or physiologically? Or are all your centers centered? When all your centers are centered, then you are in a place usually of well-being, in all of those fashions, energetically, physiologically, and psychologically.
Fascinating stuff, Jazz.
All right, thanks, Ryan. I'm just going to take one from someone else. Julian wants to say something. Julian, go ahead. Hello, Julian. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Am I?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you got your hand up.
Fantastic. Hi, Jazz, and thanks for this. This has been fascinating.
Thank you.
I am very interested in supporting businesses to move from an unconscious state to more of a conscious state. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Really, the excessive competition that we've seen versus collaboration, the excessive shareholder drive versus a more broader stakeholder and higher purpose drive. And I was just wondering whether you've thought about this in combination with what you said earlier on in terms of finding the sensitivity in the system to transform with minimum energy.
Yes, I have actually. There's another webinar I'm going to do soon actually on collaboration and competition,
Right.
which I've presented to quite a few business presentations, business events. And specifically it looks at how we live in a world where there's a lot of collaboration illiteracy. You know, we're all very au fait with competition and it's almost comes natural to us. But the fact is collaboration also comes natural to us as well, but it kind of gets stifled because competition is more welcome in the world. It seems to be a better way of getting more for yourself, which we live in a media environment and a political environment which seems to focus on that. Now, what I found is that collaboration and competition are meant to work together. Otherwise, you know, collaboration itself, you know, wouldn't stand on its own, be pulled up by its own bootstraps if it couldn't work with competition. You know. Mm-hmm. So what I found is this, that collaboration consists of several steps, and you've got to go through each of these steps if you want to have greater and greater collaboration. The first step is connection. Without a connection, you can't really have any conversation with anybody. After you've started to have conversations with people, you might cooperate with them and contribute to one another in the short term, and that doesn't require much trust. It can be done in a very transactional kind of way. But then if you feel you've contributed enough to each other and you've got enough of a connection around the right things, you might then decide, well, let's commit to something bigger. I know it's going to involve more risk, more money, more time, but let's sign a contract. Let's commit to doing something where we collaborate for the long term and not just short-term small things, transactional things. Usually at that point, when you commit to collaborating, then you focus on creating something together that you're going to communicate out into the world, to a bigger audience, to a bigger set of connections other than the ones that you just had. Now what's fascinating is when you're going around the cycle that kind of way, then that's collaboration. But I found often people get stuck at a particular stage and they move backwards. And obviously if you're moving in reverse through a collaboration cycle, then you're probably entering into a state of competition. So, for example, if the time comes to commit to something but a person doesn't want to go forwards from there, then it's usually because they want to have more contribution to themselves, or the other person wants more contribution for themselves. So that's a return to more self-centered kind of motives, which typically is a seed for competition. So competition exists between the various stages of collaboration. And sometimes it's necessary, because if you can't go forwards between a particular point, you then have to look and go, well, are we respecting the individuals and what they're looking for here? So you have to look at the competing interests and do something to address them. So if you get stuck at any stage, it's probably because there's some competitive factor that needs to be addressed, or there's individual interests that need to be addressed before you can go forwards. So competition is an integral part of the evolution of collaboration. And when I presented this to people in business, they immediately look at the collaboration cycle and go, oh, I can see exactly where I'm stuck. You know, we're trying to get commitment from this person, but they don't feel that we've contributed enough, or we're contributing enough, or maybe it's something before that we're just not cooperating, or we've not had enough conversations, or we're not connected based on the right reasons. That person's interested in having fun. I want to do something serious. That kind of connection is just never going to work. So having the right kind of connection, and then going through each of the stages of having conversations and cooperating and contributing and committing and collaborating and creating and communicating out something to a bigger set of connections, that's a whole cycle. And at the end of the cycle, you've really ended up connecting into a bigger audience that you're trying to get to collaborate with you around what you've created. There are occasions when, if you're going backwards along the cycle, you can end up, if you follow it backwards, you instead of connecting to people and you lose your communication with them, you stop collaborating, or you stop creating around things, you stop collaborating, you start losing commitment, you stop contributing to each other, and as a consequence you stop cooperating, you stop having conversations, and in the end you just lose your connection with them altogether. That's the reverse process. And I'm sure there's probably been occasions where you had that go on. You know? The collaboration cycle is, like I said, something I'm going to do a webinar on soon. But you can get the documents for that on my website, socialvitamins.co.uk. If you go there, on the front page, you'll see there's a document called Empowering Change Through Collaboration. And that covers the collaboration cycle and the key points of it. So that might be something you want to have a look at. And tune in for the collaboration webinar that I'm going to do in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Julian. Okay, we're just going to take a couple of more questions, and then we're probably going to finish. I can't see any more hands up for the time being. But Mercedes has said, do you have any views about conspiracy theories and depopulation or about chemtrails? Well, that's obviously very much in the periphery of what I'm talking about, I think. I'm never one to believe in conspiracy theories. However, I do understand that sometimes there are things that need to be done in this earth which to an ordinary individual might look bad, but for the sake of the great good, it's thought to be good. But of course, it depends on who's actually thinking that. You know, if you're Hitler, that's one thing. If you're Gandhi, that's something else. So it's important whenever you're looking at anything which brings into doubt people in authority that you also take into account that a lot of these people are literally human beings. There's always questions about some people being human beings, whether they're reptilian or something else. But on the whole, you're going to find that the majority of people that you're meeting are human. And you'll also find there's a reason why human beings are of such interest, perhaps to even alien races, when people have had discussions about that. And it's because if you look at what human beings actually are on Earth, then you'll probably discover the answer. The Chinese say that there's an order to how intelligence is connected into throughout the universe. Minerals are eaten and consumed in order for plants to live and to have the structure and functions that they do. But plants are eaten by animals in order for them to have the structure and function that they do. And then you have other animals eating those animals, and you have an order in terms of prey and predator. Typically, the higher predators tend to have higher forms of consciousness, although that's not necessarily true with some of those living organisms like whales or dolphins. But the fact is, the smarter you are, the more of a predator you can be, but also the more of a savior you can actually be too. And if you look at humans, which consume everything, then in a way you could take it up one level further and say, well, what is it that consumes humans? What is it that consumes the products, perhaps, of what human beings produce? And the unique thing that human beings produce or possess is consciousness. So if in a matrix-like way we are responsible for creating consciousness, which is then consumed by higher level beings, then it makes you wonder what it is that we are in service to. However, I believe that human beings have the capability within them, features which are yet dormant, but nevertheless can be activated within our DNA. Not extra strands of DNA, but just our existing DNA. There's a certain percentage of it which looks after our physical management in this life. But there are parts of our DNA which I think are not to do with us as individuals, but to do with us as a species. And when you activate those parts, the species actually evolves to a new level. And I think there are some people who are trying to do their best to help the species evolve to a new level, and then there are others that are not interested in that, and they're quite keen on just being putting us into positions where we're easily controllable. So I look at everything in that term. I think, is what's being done to suppress evolution, or is it being done to advance it? With regards to depopulation and chemtrails, for a long time I've suspected chemtrails are to do with climate management. It's a way of affecting the atmosphere and reducing global warming. But of course there are consequences down here on Earth, just as there are consequences for using pesticides in crops. They can cause all sorts of problems as opposed to just, save our food supply or save our ability to look after ourselves. I don't think chemicals are the answer, though, to be honest. I think we need to change our behaviour and change our way of being, the way we respect nature and how we work together in a sustainable way with it. That's probably far more helpful, I think, to global warming than just chuffing some chemicals in the air or trying to manipulate people by controlling things like population or genetically altering food, for example. These are the actions of a dying breed, and that's the way I look at it. And the breed that's surviving, the breed that's evolving positively and in a more respectful and sustainable way, they're the ones that are going to survive. And anything which is done out of desperation usually leads to effects which require further desperate measures to address, and it goes in a vicious circle. So it's a good idea never to get into a desperate situation in the first place, and if you can, try and have a society and a life where everything's being done in a respectful and sustainable way, and then you won't have to get into these situations where these emergency measures are actually taken. I hope that answers that particular question, Mercedes. I can just see if I can track you down and see if you've got a response to that. Is that okay, Mercedes?
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I realise I did lower the tone of that question, but I was very keen to know what your views would have been. So many, many thanks. And it was a wonderful webinar. So I'm sure on behalf of everyone else, I can safely say thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. I think Hazel has got something to say. So I'll just switch her on. Hazel?
Hello.
Hello,
oh,
Giggly.
am I on? Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Hello. Oh, hi. Well, no, I was just saying thank you. Actually, that last point, and I almost missed it. Oh, gosh. The bit about, where were you talking about? Oh, gosh, it's gone. About changing the global, it's effectively about changing global consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it's to do with geometry and to do with people's DNA and how we shift it. Mm-hmm. And they'll become, I presume, like a tipping point, like the 100th monkey effect. So when we become moving more towards fractal, if you like, or from the crystalline, that it'll become. I'm not making any sense at all.
No, I get you. There is a tipping point, and I've actually done the maths for this. And it's based on studies that were done around transcendental meditation, where people were trying to cause shifts in the consciousness of a city in Washington, and that was monitored by the mayor's office and the police service, and they found that crime was reduced by 23% when 4,000 meditators got together, and when they all meditated together, it seemed to somehow shift the underlying fabric of consciousness in the city, and crime was reduced by 23%. And the rule was that for a given population of people, if you take the square root of 1% of that population, then that number of people is all you need to change the consciousness of that population. But that is a number which, if you take the example of London, with the millions of people it has, you would need something in the order of 200 or 300 people, about 300 people, to come together with the same consciousness, maybe the same intention, and by meditating on the same thing, they could reduce the crime rate in the city or alter the consciousness of the population in a certain kind of way. However, the problem is that the people who come together often are not necessarily following the same paths in life. They may come together with the same intention, but they may have very different journeys in life, and which means that a lot of the energy that they bring is heading in different directions, even though it's coinciding at that point. So it kind of dilutes the effect to some degree, and it's a question I always ask, why was it only 23%? Why wasn't it more? And the reason is because people have different life journeys. They may come together with the same intent, but their energies are being pulled in different directions, and therefore the effect was such that it only led to a 23% drop. However, if you get people on journeys that are complementary to each other as opposed to being in opposition to each other, then when those people get together with the same intent, then you find that you need less people to cause the same effect. In fact, you need perhaps the square root of the number that you've got. So if a city the size of London, as I said, normally you would need 300 people using conventional meditational techniques to affect the consciousness of that kind of population of about 8 million or whatever it is, I think it is. However, if people are brought together and their journeys are aligned as well as their intentions, then you need the square root of that, which is about 17 people. So it turns out 17 people who are perfectly aligned to each other in terms of their energies in a resonant, harmonious way, when they come together with the same intention, that's all you would need. You would just need 17 people perfectly aligned to affect the consciousness of a city the size of London. Now, it turns out that to affect the whole population of the UK, I think you need about 20 odd people, something like that. To affect the whole population of the world, you would need about 100 people who are perfectly aligned to each other. So it works very similar to the way that energy does with conventional explosives and nuclear energy. If you take some TNT, it creates a little bang, but if you take the same amount of uranium or plutonium and release the energy from that, it's like billions of times more powerful. So you don't need so much of it to cause the same amount of effect. And it's a similar sort of principle here. When energies are aligned, a chain reaction can actually begin, which causes shifts in people's perceptions. And that chain reaction spreads, not in a viral way, but in a chain reactive way. And you can shift a vast population of consciousness just using a couple of dozen people whose energies are perfectly aligned, and whose life lessons are aligned to one another, and they come together with a common intention. It takes that little number of people to affect that large number of population. 100 people is all you need to change the world, who are perfectly aligned and learning complementary life lessons with one another. And that's partly what the resonance experiment's about. It's helping people find the others that they're aligned to, and then if out of all the billions there are in the world, if you could find that 100 who, when they were perfectly aligned, would start a chain reaction in their own perceptions, which is spread to everybody around them, then you would see a shift in the world. But you don't have to begin at a global level. You can begin at a local level. I said, a city the size of London, you would only need 17 people. But the problem is this: finding 17 people out of a city of maybe 10 million people, you probably would need at least something in the order of a sample of 10 or 20,000 people to get a good chance that you're going to find 17 people that are really, really closely aligned to each other. So the experiment's really aimed at trying to build that number of people up higher and higher until eventually the right people can find themselves. And it's not just going to be one group. There could be lots of groups of 17 people, that are perfectly aligned to each other. And you can imagine one group is going to be powerful enough, but if these tribes of individuals were to all get together, then, of course, those individuals could affect the whole country. They could affect the whole world. So it is possible. It just requires a good design to help people bring people together, and that's really what my software is about, the Social Vitamins software and the Resonance Experiment. Its focus is to do that. I've not focused that necessarily on earning money. I've focused that on bringing people together and to start connecting into their own resonance, connecting their resonance with other people's, and ultimately shifting the vibration of their relationships so that it extends beyond them into the world and causes a shift in the vibration and consciousness of the world. So there's not much of a threshold. It just takes, 20,000 people compared to however many hundreds of millions, are on something like Facebook. It's not much.
Really isn't it? And on a one-to-one basis, so the stories about somebody, say, like a Jesus who, that people would be healed by coming into his presence, or something like an Amma or something. Is it a similar kind of premise then?
Yeah, because you can start on yourself. If you are in a state of resonance with yourself and all your thoughts and feelings are in alignment to one another, they're in harmony with one another, you are in a state of compassion with yourself and everything around you, and you are in a state of grace or love within yourself, then clearly anybody who comes into your presence is going to be moved before you open your mouth. You will have a presence, a gravitas about you, which literally colours the energy field around you. So that as soon as someone comes into your presence, it shifts your perceptions. And I said earlier, you might burst into laughter, you might burst into tears, which is what happens with people like Amma and others. People just come into their field and their perceptions shift and they burst into laughter or burst into tears.
Is it an entrainment? Does it just entrain them really quickly?
It's partly to do with what I mentioned earlier and that you see on the screen right now, which is, for example, to do with compassion and anger and courage and wisdom. For example, if I've got a lot of compassion in me and somebody else has got a lot of anger in them, then what happens is this: the anger sits on top of the person's compassion, and the compassion in them is suppressed or buried, if you will. If I come along and my field of energy is rich with compassion, it will supplement theirs. It means their compassion will rise and the anger that's sitting on top will come out of them. I will make them angry because of the amount of compassion I have in my field, supplementing theirs and their compassion rising and pushing the anger out of them. And I've had this experience quite a lot. I've sat with people and for no reason whatsoever they start getting angry with me and upset or something, and I realise, my compassion is just supplementing theirs, and the anger that's sitting on top is just coming out, and this is just a healing response. It's all that's going on. So yeah, if you're Amma, for example, and you're full of compassion, it might also not just displace any anger you have inside of you, but it fills you up with so much compassion that suddenly you get how you've not been treating yourself right, and maybe even how you've not been treating other people right. And the massive shift in perception that leads to is such that a chain reaction of shifts in perception happen between all your perceptions in your mind. And you go through this huge kind of consciousness explosion, and you suddenly see the truth. And you see how you've not been lying to it, how you've been really performing an injustice towards yourself and other people. And that's usually where you start feeling shame or guilt. That stuff starts to come out. The wisdom pushes the fear out. The anxiety gets pushed out with a new level of trust inside of you. So unfortunately, the anger, the fear, and the anxiety is what typically will come out, but it will be replaced by with compassion, wisdom, and trust. And the consequence usually is somebody who suddenly has a huge influx of compassion or wisdom or trust gets so emotional that they'll either burst into tears or they'll burst into laughter.
Yeah.
And it's linked with these geometries. So I said people like Amma do this all the time, and they've got their geometries inside arranged in such a way that when somebody else's geometry comes and docks in with theirs, those are the consequences.
Right. Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
I like the laughter one. Oh, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Well, there's no more hands up, so what I'm going to do is bring the webinar to a close. I trust the webinar itself was informative and that the discussion that we've had highlights some additional points that you may have had questions about. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today, And I just want you to also know that this has been recorded, so I'm going to put a link out for you to be able to listen to this in your own time if you want to, and you're welcome to share it with others as soon as I actually put the link out. So a big thank you to each of you who've contributed to the discussion today, and I look forward to you coming to another webinar soon, and your contributions then, and the subject that I'll be talking about with regards to that particular webinar. In the meantime, have a great day, and have a great week, and have a great life. Thank you.